The town had called it a cold feet tragedy and then folded it into the hush of its porches and prayer circles. In 1982, the bride who disappeared on the eve of her wedding became a whisper that clung to church rafters and checkout lines, a warning mothers passed to daughters with a sigh, sometimes love walked away. People said she had gotten nervous, had slipped out with a suitcase under a quilt in the back of a taxi, had called no one. Her fiancé waited at the altar with a jaw that trembled and a bouquet that sagged under the lights. He stood there until the organist's fingers cramped. He swore he loved her. He swore she had left without a note. He swore he did not know why. That was the first story the town believed because it was easier to hold a story of fear than a story of harm. For years after, a single dress hung in a cedar closet in her mother's home, the lace yellowing, the buttons neat rows of small bone circles that shut against the air as if protecting a secret no one could hear. In 2023, a lab found skin cells around one of those buttons and gave back a name that tore the town's face in half: the local wedding photographer, the man who had posed couples by oak trees and barn doors for decades, the man who had documented 1,000 vows. The bride who vanished in 1982 had not run. The story of trust, reputation, small towns, and the DNA revolution did not fit into any hymn the town knew how to sing. In the summer of 1982, she had walked down Main Street with a list, ticking off errands with the pointed, precise energy she used for everything. She was the kind of person who returned a borrowed book to the exact shelf it had come from, the kind of person who folded receipts flat. Her name floated in conversation like a light touch: the bride, the teacher's daughter, the girl with hands that made perfect cinnamon rolls. She had a fiancé who worked at the mill, a man who counted overtime as a love language and had hands nicked by machines and metal. Their wedding invitation stood on every mantelpiece between the river and the highway. The local photographer had met her in the church hall the day before the ceremony to check light through stained glass and judge angles. He had asked her to pin the dress and stand by a window, just for a test. He had said it would save time tomorrow. He had said he had an eye for moments, that nothing escaped his lens. He had said the right things the way men who knew small towns said them: careful, respectful, familiar. He had framed newlyweds for 20 years. He had held babies, fixed boutonnieres, coaxed a smile from a groom's stubborn mouth. Reputation wrapped him like a suit. When she did not come home that night, people called it a panic a young woman could have, standing on the last ledge of her life before it turned into the long drop of routines. The fiancé sat on the porch swing and said nothing. The mother pressed her palms together until they creaked, and the father drove circles between the diner and the church with headlights unfurling in the dark like search beams. The sheriff walked front yards for the performance of comfort. The photographer offered help. He paced the lawn with a camera around his neck, ready, he said, to develop a poster from any snapshot the family had. He took the mother's hands, told her he would pour hours into the darkroom. He had an old way of wiping his glasses with a monogrammed cloth that made him look humbled. No one in that town turned suspicion toward a man who had captured their best days on paper. The dress sat in its cedar closet breathing cedar and dust. It held what it had held the last time fingers had fastened its buttons. Nobody thought to touch it. Nobody felt entitled to ruin the last object that still smelled like the life she was supposed to have. The fiancé kept working shifts, the ring like a blunt weight on a string in his pocket. For years he dated no one and then married quickly, as if to outrun the shadow that had earned its own chair in every room. A small town had its own immune system for scandal. It sealed around things. It swallowed the edges, filed them smooth with Sunday coffee. The photographer kept working. He aged well. With silver hair that made him look like a monument to reliability. His studio smelled like fixer and paper. Brides cried when he reminded them to take a breath before stepping out of a dressing room. Grooms shook his hand for calming their mothers. He was at every wedding because he had always been at every wedding. Reputation was a beaded curtain you could part with a finger, on the other side was the man he let you see. The bride from 1982 receded into photographs she never took, into the box of a timeline no one reopened. The DNA revolution did not arrive with fanfare in that town. It arrived in the form of a cousin who had spit into a tube to find a grandfather, in the form of a seminar where a deputy learned that old evidence could yield new voices, in the form of a young prosecutor with a quiet face who had not learned to bow to the town's hierarchies. She stood in the cedar closet with the mother, now older, now someone with a face lined by waiting. The prosecutor said she wanted to send the dress away. The mother bristled because the dress had become a reliquary, as holy as a tomb. The mother gave in because grief could become tired enough to gamble. The fiancé, now an older man who had made his peace with silence and with the way eyes cut toward him at the post office, stood in the yard and watched the prosecutor carry a garment bag to a car. If that bag had held a person, he would have felt less absurd. The lab peeled back the fabric of time with tweezers and patience. Each button surrendered a swab, each swab surrendered cells 1,000,000 times smaller than grief. When the profile spoke, it spoke without manners or memory. The match did not land on an ex-boyfriend or a drifter. It landed on a man with a studio on Walnut Street, who had photographed the county commissioner's 4th wedding and the sheriff's niece's prom. The local wedding photographer's DNA lay around the button that fastened at the bride's throat, a place a lover would have touched, a place a stranger would have had no reason to press. The story of 1982 bent around that revelation like metal under sudden heat. When the deputies walked into the studio, the photographer had a tray of prints floating in chemicals. He looked up with irritation because interruptions blurred the point. He did not run. Men like him rarely did. He looked confused in a practiced way. He said words that had carried him through 1,000 civic interactions: gentleman, surely, misunderstanding, helpful. The deputies did not raise their voices because volume was an admission of nerves. They told him about the button. Behind him, a bride laughed in a frame, her veil tossed by a summer wind from 1996. Somewhere on a shelf, a proof book recorded the 2003 wedding where the photographer had smoothed a bride's hair with the back of his hand and called it fatherly. On a work table lay a camera strap worn into the leather by years of necks. He said he had photographed the bride from 1982. He said he often helped with fittings. He said he might have fastened a button. He said that explained everything. The deputies escorted him to a car because sometimes even in a small town, rituals reversed. People gathered in groups like iron filings, aligning themselves to whatever magnet their histories offered them. Some said the bride from 1982 had vanished because she had wanted to and that this DNA thing was a gimmick the city used when it wanted headlines. Some said the photographer had a kindness that looked, in this new light, like access. Some remembered the way he had insisted a teenage bridesmaid take off a cardigan because it spoiled the line of a photo. Some defended him because he had given them free enlargements when their fathers died. The fiancé, whose face had hardened into the shape of a man who had survived through contraction, stood at his kitchen sink rinsing a coffee cup with methodical ferocity. He remembered the way the photographer had put a hand on his shoulder in 1982 and said she had probably decided she was not ready, that these things happened, that he should carry himself with dignity on the day after. Every word rang like a bell with a crack he had not noticed. The prosecutor built a case from absence and atoms. There were no bones, no grave, no confession. There was the button and what clung to it. There were notes from 1982 about a bruise on the fiancé's knuckles that he had gotten from punching a wall behind the church. There were witnesses who remembered the photographer checking locks and windows, a helpful man in the wrong rooms. There was the seamstress who had said the buttons were tight and took 2 sets of hands to secure. There was a florist who had heard a laugh behind a closed door and thought it sounded not like joy but like a warning someone swallowed. In a place that had always valued the visible, painted fences, polished silver, polished manners, the invisible now asked for trust. A reporter who grew up in that town returned with a notebook and a voice that had learned to be neutral. She interviewed the mother in a living room that still kept a place for the missing daughter's mug, washed once a week, turned toward the sun. She visited the studio with its clean counters and its archive smelling of stopped time. She asked the photographer about the science. He said anyone could plant anything. He said he had enemies. He said his fingers had brushed 1,000 throats fastening 1,000 strings of pearls when brides needed help. He said the town knew him. Reputation stepped into the interview like a second voice, deep and calm, explaining away the scrape in the air. The reporter went to the attic of the mother's house where cardboard boxes softened with age sagged at the corners. The boxes held ribbon, brittle invitations, dried flowers. She found a second garment bag with a veil, a comb still in it, the teeth catching light from a single bulb. She asked if she could take photographs. The mother nodded. The reporter photographed the dress the lab had borrowed and returned, now tagged and catalogued and all at once less sacred and more. She wrote the sentence that would begin her story. In 1982, a bride disappeared on the eve of her wedding, and in 2023 a button told the truth. She interviewed the fiancé who had remarried and divorced and remarried again and learned in the process how to carry grief like a coin in a pocket, something he could turn with his fingers while he walked. He said the town did not deserve the gentleness his first love had given it. He said the town believed the easy story until the hard story used a microscope to kick the door in. When the case went to a grand jury, the courthouse filled with a kind of suspense that felt less like curiosity and more like reckoning. The pastor who had turned pages on a Bible for 40 years prayed without being certain who he prayed for. The mill workers argued over dominoes on their lunch tables, their hands heavy with the dirt that no soap fully took away. Old men leaned on trucks, talking about how science had no manners for elders. Teenagers looked up procedures on their phones and explained PCR like a campfire ghost story. The prosecutor walked home past porches where eyes tracked her, quiet and bright. She knew she represented the kind of trust that had to be built with numbers and blood rather than casseroles and borrowed tools. The photographer posted a letter on the door of his studio, framed behind glass, typed in a font that suggested order. He declared his innocence. He declared his heartache for the bride from 1982. He declared his horror at the suggestion that he had harmed anyone. Inside the studio, negatives hung in neat sleeves, thousands of lives caught in the half-light of elevators and open fields. Behind them, in drawers, lay the discards, frames where a hand shielded a face, where a mouth bent the wrong way, where an expression flashed raw before it was corrected. The reporter asked to see them. He refused politely. He said outtakes were private. He said his art mattered. A letter arrived for the prosecutor without a return address, written in careful block letters. It named a place near the river where teenagers had once parked, a place where the photographer often scouted for golden hour shoots. It claimed he met the bride there the night before the wedding for light tests. It claimed the groom had been told to stay home and rest, that the bride had gone alone. The letter did not claim to know more because people like that wrote letters with just enough to tilt the floor underfoot. The deputies went to the place by the river. The water slid by with what looked like indifference. They walked the bank where roots webbed across the dirt and pulled back brush. They found a rusted hair comb snagged in a tangle of wild vine. The mother recognized the comb's teeth that afternoon. The seamstress recognized the veil's edge from a photograph. The prosecutor placed the comb in a bag the way one might lower a body, with ceremony and dread. The fiancé went to the church on a weekday when the sanctuary was empty and sat in the back pew. He pressed his knuckles to his lips. He had once imagined a life of getting the truck fixed and repainting the back bedroom and worrying over money in ordinary months. He had not imagined carrying decades of suspicion like a smell that wouldn't wash out, not until the DNA from a button opened windows in every room. He tried to imagine the photographer's hand on his bride's throat or his bride's wrist or her waist. He tried to reconcile Jovial and Wolf. He failed, and in that failure felt something like nausea that had waited 21,000 days to arrive. The organist came in and shuffled music. The fiancé stood. Both pretended not to have seen the other's tears. People who had trusted the photographer with their weddings found themselves turning albums face down on coffee tables as if the images might watch them. The grocery clerk who had set aside extra eggs for him on holidays put them back on the shelf with a little shake of her hands. The sheriff parked farther down the street when he went to the studio to serve a summons because visibility now had a geometry to it. The reporter wrote a feature about the way small towns built fences out of reputation, fences that kept secrets inside until the DNA revolution ran a wire cutter along every post. She interviewed a biologist from the state university who spoke in small, careful sentences about degradation and probability, about the way a touch could linger in the hearth of a buttonhole for decades, waiting to be translated. In the old darkroom behind the studio, the photographer had kept files no one else had touched. Each had a label in his slanted hand. Each contained a few frames never delivered, faces drawn tight by something like fear, a stain blooming at a collarbone, a veil caught too close to a mouth. He told himself he had collected these as cautionary tales of imperfection. He told himself many things in the language of men who had learned to make their own alibis. The deputy who carried the warrant stood over the drawer and felt the weight of a town shift under his boots. A woman who married in 1987 called the prosecutor after the evening news. She said the photographer had asked her to come alone to the studio 2 days after the ceremony to finish a roll. She said she had brought her sister. She said he had been disappointed in a way that darkened the room. She said she had never told anyone. A man who married in 1993 remembered nothing unusual, then woke at 3 in the morning and remembered the photographer's breath in his ear while adjusting a tie. People resaw their pasts under the blue light of a lab report and felt the world they had curated for themselves flicker. The reporter's voicemail filled. The pastor's office did too. The bride from 1982 stood suddenly in everyone's kitchen, hair done, buttons fastened, half turned toward a window as if listening for her own life. The fiancé took out the one photograph he had of her in the dress, a fitting day snapshot, off-center, a friend's Polaroid where her smile had not yet learned to be formal, and placed it on his table. He touched the image at her throat where the button lay like a little moon. He spoke aloud for the first time in years in that kitchen. He said her name as if it were a prayer long prohibited. The sound filled the room without apology. Down the street, in the studio, the photographer sat under a bright lamp answering questions with the same voice he had used to ask brides to tilt their chins. The deputy recorded. The prosecutor watched. The reporter watched. The mother watched the clock at home the way she had watched it the day school buses should have brought her daughter back and did not. In a box in the mother's attic, there was a paper napkin from the rehearsal dinner, the bride's lipstick mark pressed against it like a seal. The prosecutor asked to test it. The mother hesitated because every object contained a fraction of the daughter's presence, and science carried a habit of chewing such presents down to numbers. The mother agreed because the town's old trust had already been broken and remade in another form. The lab found nothing useful because time had eaten the edges of what it could use. That failure felt honest. Not every relic yielded. Not every hope survived translation. Yet the button had spoken, and that voice kept sounding in court documents and in the private craters of people's minds. The courtroom smelled of old varnish and dust warmed by bodies. The judge read the charges. The photographer stood. He wore the kind of suit men wore to funerals. He did not look at the fiancé. The fiancé did not look at him. The mother held a handkerchief that had been her mother's. The reporter's pen moved. The prosecutor began to talk about 1982 as if it were not a room shrouded in cobwebs but a room with open windows through which the present could walk. She said the words button and DNA and contact and transfer. She said the words trust and opportunity. She said the photographer's name. In the back row, a girl who had grown up with the legend of the runaway bride felt her stomach drop as if a carnival ride had fallen out from under her. In that moment she understood what the town had not taught her: reputations were not fences but fog. Outside, the oak trees dropped acorns as if to insist that time owned everything. The river ran as it had in 1982, as it had in 2023, washing past the place where the comb had waited for hands. The fiancé left the courthouse during a recess and walked to his truck. He sat behind the wheel with his head on his forearm and listened to nothing. He thought of the way she had fastened the topmost button badly, always slightly crooked, and how he had teased her softly for it, and how the photographer had said he could help, and how everyone had admired men who helped. He felt the kind of anger that did not need a target because it had already colonized every object in sight. He breathed through it. He counted to 30. He returned to the courtroom because that was where the new story was being built, the story of a bride who had not run, a fiancé who had not been abandoned, a town that had learned that trust without verification was worship, and a revolution that had hidden in a buttonhole for 41 years, waiting for a lab to listen. The reporter's article published that evening with a photograph of the courthouse steps. She had not printed the faces. She had printed the steps worn down by generations of feet, the kind of image the photographer might have taken without understanding what it meant. She wrote about the small town that had loved its images more than its truths, the way families had framed the past to fit the wall. She wrote about the DNA revolution and how it had turned keepsakes into witnesses. People read the piece at kitchen tables, at the diner, in their cars idling in driveways because idling gave their hands something to do. They did not speak for a while afterward. They stood and washed dishes and fed dogs and folded towels. Then they called each other and began the slow accounting of who they had trusted and why. In the darkroom, the deputies found a box marked miscellaneous. Inside lay a handful of buttons, a ribbon of veil, a scrap of lace. Souvenirs, the photographer said, from alterations and repairs. Gifts, he said, from brides who had insisted he take a token. He said he had kept them because he loved his work. The deputies sealed the box. The lab would open it later. The story of 1982 and of 2023 threaded through every seal, every signature, every recorded chain of custody. The chain looked like a rosary held by hands that trembled, each beat a decision about whose story to believe. That night, the fiancé sat at his table with the Polaroid and the ring that had slept in his drawer, and he laid them side by side. He began to speak into a tape recorder the reporter had left with him because she said sometimes saying the truth made it firmer. He spoke about the last week before the wedding, about lists and laughter and small arguments about flowers. He spoke about the photographer and how he had admired the man's patience, the way he adjusted light, the way everyone said he made them look like their best selves. He said he had been grateful. He said he had been a fool. He did not believe the second cancelled out the first. He let both sit in the room together like two people who did not speak but refused to leave. He did not say the story was over. He had learned that stories, like rivers, could not be told to stop. The tape recorder clicked as the fiancé spoke into the quiet room, and outside the kitchen window the streetlights caught the dust in the air like snow that refused to settle. His voice thickened when he reached the part about the rehearsal night in 1982, when she had tried on the dress again because the seamstress had fretted about the way the bodice sat. He remembered how the topmost button had been stubborn and how he had reached to help and she had swatted his hand with a laugh, telling him it was bad luck to touch the dress before the ceremony. He remembered the phone call that followed, the photographer's easy baritone asking if she could meet for a 10-minute light test because the forecast promised cloud and he wanted a perfect exposure under the stained glass. He had said yes because in a small town a man like that did not require a guard. That yes lay on the table now between the Polaroid and the ring like a shard of glass. In 2023, the case files multiplied and thickened. The prosecutor's office turned conference rooms into archives of 1,982 handwritten statements, cassette recordings of interviews, grainy photographs of lawns and porches and the church hall. The DNA from the button at the bride's throat returned again and again like a bell that would not stop ringing, the unique symphony of alleles that spoke the photographer's name more reliably than any neighbor. A forensic genealogist, soft-spoken, with the tired kindness of someone who watched people's family trees upend their lives, sat with the prosecutor and mapped relatives across county lines. She pointed to second cousins and great-nieces whose saliva had joined the DNA revolution in the hope of finding ancestors and had instead placed a living man at the heart of a vanished girl's last hour. The defense hired its own expert and built a scaffolding of alternate explanations. The photographer's attorney, a man with silver cufflinks and a voice that never rose, said contamination lurked in every evidence room. He said chain of custody in 1982 had been a joke told between deputies who kept their pens in their breast pockets without lids. He said the dress had been handled by the seamstress, the mother, 3 bridesmaids, a choir member who had left lipstick on a sleeve by accident. He said the button's skin cells could have come from a fitting in which he had helped because he was helpful. He did not say the word reputation, but it hung in the courtroom like cologne. The prosecutor answered by unrolling the chain of custody paper like a scroll in church. She read names and dates until boredom made the defense itch. She held up the photograph of the button, the tiny white circle that had waited 41 years for a question precise enough to release its answer. The reporter followed the town through those days the way a hound followed a scent, nose low to the ground, catching every shift. She sat with a florist who confessed she had always disliked the photographer because he rearranged bouquets. She stood in a driveway with the county commissioner's fourth wife, who insisted he had saved her wedding in 2009 by sewing a torn hem with a pocket kit. She met the organist in the church's side room while dust drifted in the light like confession, and the organist said the photographer had an ear for the right moment in a recessional, how he always knew when a bride looked most radiant. How he had joked that he had probably seen more raw nerves than a surgeon. In 1982, that line had sounded funny. In 2023, it sounded like a tooth against glass. The sheriff, older now, shoulders bowed, jaw a hinge that had held too many lies, sat alone one afternoon and read his own report from 1982 as if a stranger had written it. He revisited the paragraph where he had spoken with the photographer on the lawn, the photographer's camera strap cutting a neat line across his chest, the lens cap off, always off. He remembered the man's hand on the mother's shoulder, the way he had drawn the family into the kind of hug that made people feel taken care of. The sheriff had liked being around him because he felt efficient by association. He closed the file and stared at his thumbs. He had been part of the town's immune system that sealed around the wound with stories about cold feet. He felt, late and useless, the heat of shame. The mother, in her careful house where the carpet in the hallway had a path worn into it by midnight pacing, began to set the table for 3 without meaning to, then corrected it, then left the extra plate on the counter as if the correction had hurt. She had let the dress go and come back. She had allowed the lab to clip a thread from a hem, to swab the interior band where a throat had rested. She had stood in her kitchen while the prosecutor explained alleles and probabilities and phrases like 1 in several trillion. She had nodded because the new language replaced the old verbs, pray, hope, wait. The mother wrote a letter to the fiancé, and when he came by she handed it to him and did not ask him to read it there. He read it later at the same kitchen table, and it said, in a hand that had practiced restraint, that she had never blamed him and had sometimes wished she had because blame was easier to carry than absence. The deputies returned to the river with a ground-penetrating radar unit borrowed from a neighboring county. The machine hummed and beeped as it rolled over dirt and root. They moved slowly, as if tiptoeing through a sleeping house. They found disturbances, old sinkholes, a dumped fence post, the unmistakable oval of an abandoned fire pit, but nothing that yielded a body. They called in a cadaver dog team. The dogs worked the bank with their bright concentration, then sat in one spot under a sycamore and stared at their handlers, waiting for a reward. The handlers marked the spot. The soil there had been turned, long ago. The prosecutor approved a cautious excavation. They sifted with small shovels, hands in nitrile gloves, heads bent. They found a buttonhole torn from a strip of lace, buried shallow. The seamstress, when shown the scrap, lifted it as if it had weight and said, softly, yes. Whispered stories surfaced. A bridesmaid from 1982 admitted that after the bride's fitting in the church hall, the photographer had shooed the girls away to save the surprise and had kept the bride by the window for a few more tests. A choir member remembered passing the closed door and hearing the photographer say, "Hold still," in a tone that sounded like prayer. The fiancé remembered being told to go pick up a corsage for the groom's mother and not to worry, the photographer would make sure the bride got home safe. The prosecutor threaded those recollections into a timeline that had the climbing tension of a hymn. The defense tried to break it apart with questions about fogged memory and the way people rewrote their personal pasts to avoid the pain of having believed an easier thing. The jury, ordinary and stubborn, listened without nodding. The photographer's studio became a specimen under glass. The deputies catalogued tripods, flashes, spools of ribbon, a battered stool bride stood on while hems were pinned. In the darkroom, a red bulb swung on its cord, casting a pulse that turned the room into a slow heartbeat. In a locked drawer they found a stack of index cards with women's names, dates, and notes in shorthand: button, veil, comb, aftermath. The defense said those were reminders of shots to take or repair tasks. The prosecutor held them up and said the words out loud: button, veil, comb. People in the gallery drew in breath as if the air had gone cold. A retired teacher who had mentored the bride in 1982 visited the fiancé with a Tupperware of rolls. She sat at his table the way she had sat at many tables, ready to fix broken things with punctual kindness. She told him the bride had been the best student she'd ever had, not because of grades, though there had been plenty of those, but because of the way she looked at the world as if it were a puzzle she could fold neatly and put away. She said she had kept a photograph of the bride tacked inside a cabinet door for decades, the kind of shrine people in small towns built to their dead when headstones did not exist. She told the fiancé she now took the photograph down and placed it on the counter instead, face up, visible. The fiancé nodded and said visibility hurt and helped in equal measure. The reporter wrote another story about the courthouse days, about how the courtroom had been too small for the town's history, how people stood in the hallway leaning toward the door as if sound could be absorbed through wood. She described the photograph the prosecutor had entered into evidence: a close-up of the top button of the dress, the thread frayed where fingers had worried it, the faint shadow where skin had pressed. She wrote the sentence that anchored the piece: in 1982, a bride disappeared on the eve of her wedding. In 2023, a button spoke the photographer's name, and the small town had to decide whether it had loved a man or his performance. She interviewed a scientist who had flown in as a consultant and who, over diner coffee, explained contact DNA transfer in the quiet tone of someone fielding grief disguised as curiosity. He said the DNA revolution had turned private objects into witnesses and that courts now struggled to weigh whispers gleaned from buttons against shouts from witnesses who had grown old believing something else. In the studio, the photographs on the wall looked back at everyone with the innocence of paper. The photographer's wife, who had married him in the mid-1990s after her first marriage burned out, stood in the doorway and did not cross the threshold. She had believed, she said later, that she knew her husband because he tamed chaos for a living. He took the frantic day of vows and ordered it into an album people could hold. She had trusted that. She had built a life with that trust. Now she stared at the frames and saw only the hands, his hands, small in so many pictures, adjusting a veil, holding a boutonniere near a throat, brushing hair from a face. The hands repeated until she wanted to smash glass. She did not. She turned and walked out. The pastor found a line of scripture he had avoided for years, the one about whitewashed tombs that looked beautiful on the outside and held rot within. He did not read it from the pulpit. He folded it into a visit to the mother's house. He sat on her couch and held her silence like a cup. He said he had failed her by endorsing a story of runaway nerves in 1982 because it required less courage from him. He said this without the expectation of forgiveness and instead with the hope that the truth, once named, would sit down in the room and allow other things to breathe. The mother nodded. She did not absolve him. She poured him tea that had steeped too long and tasted like repaired furniture. They drank it anyway. The prosecutor prepared for a fight over admissibility. The defense moved to exclude the button, saying the dress had been stored in a closet that invited contamination, that the mother had opened and closed the garment bag for years, that a mouse had once chewed the hem the width of a fingernail. The judge listened, face impassive. The prosecutor called the lab director, who explained the testing protocols, the controls, the negative swabs that had run clean. She spoke of allelic dropout and degradation like a poet reciting the names of stars. The judge admitted the DNA. A murmur ran through the courtroom like a small storm through wheat. The fiancé exhaled a breath he had not known he held. In those weeks, the town learned to live with two clocks, one that ticked 1982, the other 2023. The grocery store conversations fused them. People described the way the bride had walked, then segued into the lab's chain of custody with a sophistication that surprised them. Children overheard and asked questions at dinner their parents could not answer without reshaping themselves. School teachers discussed media literacy and the difference between a reputation and a record. The mayor avoided the topic until his own daughter came home with a homework sheet about forensic science. He read it at the kitchen table and felt like an extra in a film whose plot he finally understood too late to matter. A second letter arrived at the prosecutor's office, this one scented faintly as if the writer had pressed it against a drawer of perfumed scarves. It contained a map sketched by hand of a place behind the old mill, a side entrance to the photographer's studio known to delivery men and smokers. The letter said the photographer sometimes ushered brides through that door to avoid bad luck glimpses from grooms. It said the door locked from the inside. The deputies visited, ran fingers along the frame, found scratches at wrist height, the kind of marks that could have been made by keys or by rings scraping wood. They photographed everything. They pulled the door from its hinges and took it in. In the lab, under angled light, the scratches resolved into arcs and lines. In one shallow groove they found dried protein, ancient and stubborn. The test returned faint but real human traces. They could not say whose. The prosecutor did not promise miracles. She promised accumulation. The fiancé returned to work, descended into the rhythm of machines and metal swarf, the old noise that had once held his life steady. At lunch he sat alone because conversations pivoted toward him and away from him like a compass that could not decide on north. A new hire sat down with him anyway, a woman who had moved to town 2 years before and who carried, with an ease locals envied, an uninvested curiosity. She asked what the bride had been like. He told her the smallest things, the way she cracked her knuckles and then shook her hands like a pianist, the way she made lists with squares to fill instead of lines to cross, the way she had kissed him on the cheek in the grocery store and then left like a scandal had just occurred. He spoke as if the room held only them. He looked up and saw other men watching him with a relief that stung, the relief of no longer believing he had scared a woman away. The reporter's next piece traced the idea of trust through the town's public life. She wrote about a mechanic whose word served as a warranty, about a barber who had known everyone's secrets and never told them until dementia took the vault's lock. She compared that culture to the lab bench where trust meant calibration logs and duplicate runs. She did not condescend. She wrote with a kind of tenderness that made people see the difference between being kind and being careful. Her editor called from the city and asked if she wanted more space. She said no, the town did not need a storm, it needed a barometer. In 1982, the bride had stood by the church hall window and tilted her face toward the glass while the photographer said, "Hold it," and then, "Perfect." In 2023, the prosecutor held the dress up before the jury and pointed to the small circle of that topmost button. She did not dramatize. She did not cry. She said the circle had held an imprint of contact, a fingerprint without ridges, a presence written in code. She said the name that code had given back. She let the quiet after it lengthen until it became a thing the jury had to sit with, heavy as a full tray at a church supper. The defense stood and asked about probabilities. The prosecutor said the probability had been breathtaking and then had stepped aside for everything else, the comb, the door scratches, the bridesmaid stories, the stack of index cards, the studio's locked drawer. She did not promise the jury a body. She promised them a story that fit the facts and not the town's comfort. That night, the mother opened the cedar closet and did not cry. She touched the dress where the lab had clipped a thread and felt both desecration and benediction. She spoke aloud the sentence that had redefined her grief. In 1982, my daughter disappeared on the eve of her wedding, and in 2023, the DNA from her button named the photographer who had stood at every vows and learned our faces too well. She pressed her forehead to the garment bag and stood in the fragrance of cedar and thyme. In the distance, a train passed, the same as it had when her daughter had been a girl, and for the first time in decades the sound did not feel like something leaving but like something arriving at last. The verdict arrived on a Thursday that smelled like rain. The jury filed in with faces that held the same guarded calm people wore to funerals. The judge asked if they had reached a decision. The foreman stood, a man who had fixed tractors for 40 years, and said one word that cracked the air: guilty. The photographer did not move. He stared at the table as if a photograph might develop there and rescue him. The mother closed her eyes and pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. The fiancé bowed his head and let out a sound that belonged to no language he had ever spoken. The prosecutor kept her gaze level, not out of triumph but out of duty to the way the story of 1982 and 2023 had braided themselves into a single rope strong enough to pull a truth to shore. The court clerk read the counts. Each count landed with the dull weight of a bell stopped by a hand. The defense announced an appeal. They stacked their papers with the crisp efficiency of men who believed the world could still be organized into columns that favored them. The judge set a date for sentencing. Outside, cameras clicked, a novelty in a town where photographs had once only meant weddings and parades. The reporter stood on the courthouse steps and recorded a few lines into her phone, her voice steady, her eyes rimmed red. She remembered the first time she had seen the bride in a photograph, the off-center Polaroid with the crooked top button, the way the smile had looked unguarded in a world that had not deserved it. She ended her report with a sentence that had followed her through the case like a refrain. In 1982, a bride disappeared on the eve of her wedding. In 2023, DNA from a button named the photographer who had stood at the heart of the town's celebrations, and the small town learned that the stories it admired most could also be the ones that blinded it. In the days that followed, the town changed its furniture. People moved albums off coffee tables. They placed the bride's photograph in places of honor. Some brought casseroles to the mother's house with an awkwardness that admitted complicity. The pastor visited the sheriff and sat with him until dusk as the older man reread his own reports and shook his head as if language itself had betrayed him. The sheriff apologized to the mother in a voice rubbed raw by years. He did not ask for absolution. He simply left a folded note on her table that said, "I believed the wrong story because it required less of me." She nodded when she read it later and put it in a drawer with the tape measure and the good scissors, the place in the house where useful things waited to be taken up. The sentencing hearing took place on a morning bright enough to feel obscene. The judge reviewed the facts and spoke the words the law required. He acknowledged the absence of a body and the presence of a pattern, the strength of the DNA from the button, the supplemental evidence, the comb, the door, the index cards, the bridesmaid's recollections, the seamstress's certainty. He sentenced the photographer to a long term that equaled, in simple arithmetic, an empty chair at 1,000 dinners. The photographer's wife sat very straight and stared at a point just above the judge's head as if focusing on a blank space could keep her from choking on the history that had lodged in her throat. When the bailiff touched the photographer's elbow, he flinched for the first time. By afternoon, the studio on Walnut Street stood dark. Children passed on bicycles and peered at the closed sign, their faces reflected in the glass where brides had once checked their hair. The new mayor convened a council meeting and addressed the town without piety. He proposed that the county fund a small cold case unit, that the police department modernize evidence storage, that the library host seminars on the difference between stories and records. He said the words trust and verification in the same sentence and did not flinch at the way older men in the back frowned. He asked the reporter to speak. She stood and described the DNA revolution the way people described a new bridge: practical, dangerous if misused, transformative when respected. She said buttons and combs and doorframes had become witnesses. She said the town had survived on the currency of reputation and that it had just learned how easily counterfeit bills circulated. The mother did not hold a memorial because there was no body to anchor ceremony. She laid the dress out on her bed for the first and last time since 1982 and touched the topmost button with her fingertip. She thanked the dress under her breath, not as an idol but as a faithful servant that had kept a secret safe until the right listener arrived. She folded it again, a careful operation that felt like closing a book at the right page. Then she opened the cedar closet and placed the dress inside with a gentleness that belonged in rooms with stained glass. She left the door ajar and sat in the hallway on the carpeted path her feet had worn with decades of waiting and breathed. The fiancé visited at dusk. They did not speak for a long time. He placed the ring that had slept in his drawer on the edge of the dresser and slid the Polaroid beside it. The three objects formed a quiet line of witness. They ate soup at the kitchen table with the tape recorder between them, its red light off at last. The reporter's final piece did not center on the verdict. It centered on the town. She wrote about the mechanic who taped calibration logs above his workbench after the trial, about the barber who began to label his jars with dates and ingredients, about the diner that started printing the sources of its produce on the menu. She saw in those small shifts the way the town learned a new grammar of trust. She visited the high school on career day and listened as a biology teacher explained alleles with colored beads to a room of freshmen who had grown up on the story of the bride from 1982 and the button from 2023. The students strung patterns and held them up to the light. The teacher asked them what else they trusted without checking. The room filled with the soft clatter of beads and the tentative sound of children learning to speak carefully. The photographer's appeal moved through the courts like a shadow that no longer startled anyone. The appellate judges read the record without the town's sentiment, and they affirmed the conviction with language as dry and precise as a ledger. The defense announced another motion. It landed without echo. The studio became a community arts space after a time, the darkroom gutted, the sink replaced with a long wooden table where teenagers painted posters for school plays. On one wall, the reporter curated an exhibit of photographs not taken by the photographer but by townspeople, grainy shots of reunions, first day of school images, a snapshot of the courthouse steps worn by use. In the gallery notes, she wrote about eyes, who looked, who got to hold the camera, who decided what remained. The fiancé retired from the mill with a handshake that felt like a rite of survival. He volunteered to refurbish the benches in the churchyard. He sanded and oiled and, when he finished, he carved a small line of text under the last bench's armrest where only a searching hand would find it: she did not run. He did not tell anyone he had done it. He simply returned on Sundays and sat in the third row, and when the hymn rose about valleys and shadows, he sang the verse without choking. The mother planted foxglove by the porch, a flower the bride had loved. In late spring, it rose like a choir along the steps, and she stood in the doorway and watched bees move from bell to bell with a steadiness that steadied her. The town held, at the library, a talk called Stories We Live By. The pastor, the sheriff, the reporter, the prosecutor, and the biology teacher sat at a folding table facing a room full of neighbors. The moderator asked them what the case had changed. The pastor said he had learned to love truth more than comfort. The sheriff said he had learned to distrust his own first instincts when they flattered him. The reporter said she had learned to write not only what happened but why the wrong story had been so appealing for so long. The prosecutor said she had learned to speak science in a voice people recognized as care. The biology teacher said she had learned to show her students that buttons and combs and doorframes could carry the past forward without superstition. At the end, the moderator asked if they trusted the town again. They did not answer in unison. They answered honestly, and in that honesty the room found a new kind of peace. On the anniversary of the vanished wedding, the church bells rang at noon. No one announced a gathering, but people came anyway and stood under the oaks. The fiancé brought a small bouquet of the flowers the bride had chosen in 1982. The mother brought the handkerchief she no longer needed. The reporter brought a notebook she did not open. The pastor read a psalm and then closed the book. In the quiet that followed, the town did not look to the photographer's old studio. It looked to one another. It held that gaze. It understood, in a way it had not in 1982, that trust could be rebuilt with small, measurable acts, calibration logs, labeled jars, chain of custody forms, the humility to say I don't know, the courage to say I was wrong. That evening, the fiancé returned to his kitchen and placed the Polaroid back on the table. He spoke into the recorder one last time because finishing did not mean silence, it meant testimony. He said the sentence exactly as it had come to define his life. In 1982, a bride disappeared on the eve of her wedding. In 2023, DNA from a button on her old dress named the photographer who had taken pictures at weddings for decades, and the town that had believed reputation learned to believe evidence. He stopped the tape and sat in the dim light until the room lost its edges and became simply a place where a man could breathe. He rose, washed the single bowl he had used for soup, dried it, placed it in the cabinet. He turned off the kitchen light. In the window, his reflection nodded to him like an old friend he could finally recognize. The river kept running past the place where the comb had waited, unchanged and therefore comforting. Foxglove along the porch bellied with bees. The cedar closet door stood slightly open, and the dress hung inside with its small circle of a button gleaming faintly when headlights passed the house at night. The town slept. The story did not vanish into rumor again. It settled into the bone of the place, not as a curse but as a lesson. Trust earned its new shape. Reputation learned to share the room with accountability. The DNA revolution moved on, quiet and relentless, turning keepsakes into witnesses and reminding small towns and cities alike that truth sometimes hid in the smallest circle, and that listening to it required both science and courage.